Happy Pride Month, everyone. I got something special for you today. Contrary to formerly popular belief, homosexuality, bisexuality, and transgenderism have been occurring throughout history since time immemorial. This is hardly untrodden ground by historians, and with the subject becoming less and less icky for the common person to discuss, there has been a veritable boom in discussions over the topic. FGO is hardly shy about playing around with historical figure sexuality, making a good amount of the characters in their story bisexual because of the nature of the Goudas. That said, we're not going to be looking at the fate interpretations and instead turn to the historical one. There is a good amount of historical figures in Chaldea that bat for different teams, some that are obvious and some that may surprise you. So today is dedicated to the gays, bis, and theys in Chaldea and their stories. So let's get into it. Disclaimer, I may miss a couple of these because historical sexuality is not at all my specialty. Also, some of these are based on historical hearsay and accepted thought, while others are based around hard evidence. Let's start with the poster girl of gayness in all of FGO, the definitive lesbian and one of the cornerstones of an entire genre, Carmilla. Carmilla comes to us from a story of the same name, written by Sheridan Le Fanu. The story of Carmilla, for those unaware, follows a girl named Laura, who is pursued at night by the titular Carmilla. Carmilla herself is described as a beautiful nighttime visitor who bites the breasts of young girls to suck the life out of them, though it does not leave any mark on the body. Throughout the story, young girls die one after another due to Carmilla, and eventually she sets her sights once again on Laura. She appears before Laura as a normal girl injured in an accident, and Laura and her family take her in to nurse her back to health. Over time, various clues point to Carmilla being more than she appears, and eventually leading to a nighttime confrontation between Laura and the vampire. The book itself does an excellent job in its portrayal of the character Carmilla, making her somewhat sympathetic as someone unable to stop their urges. The story ends with a vampire hunt and the death of Carmilla. Now, that is a super condensed version of the story and one that is not doing it enough justice, but given the time when it was released and its exploration of sexuality, this book stood as a landmark of the genre. In fact, it helped to solidify the vampire motif in fiction, often being used as an allusion to homosexuality, a trope that is used in the tale of the most famous vampire in history, Dracula. The actual sexuality of Dracula is often debated among literary scholars, and God knows I am not willing to throw my hat into that ring, but there is irrefutable evidence that the seduction of a victim, regardless of gender, is Dracula's preferred form of hunting. You can call this his instincts as a supernatural predator if you want to live the good Christian life, or explore what this means for a character if you were more adventurous, but the evidence is on the table for whatever path you choose. The next one is one that ebbs on the side of a very bad look, but must be discussed regardless. Emperor Nero. Nero was a problematic figure in history regardless of how you slice it. He was mentally unwell, paranoid, flamboyant, and bloodthirsty. Is this because he was bisexual? No, it's because he was Roman. Let's sidetrack for a second to discuss something important about sexuality in ancient Roman culture. To start, no word for homosexuality or heterosexuality existed in Roman Latin, and for the smartass who will point out that both homo and hetero are both Latin in origin, these are modern phrases that use Latin. Rather, it was accepted in ancient Rome that an attraction to a beautiful youth regardless of gender was normal. Youths in this context is a blanket term for teenagers, though some Romans did aim younger. However, this did seem to be at least a little bit less accepted and seen as morally improper if it was done with a natural-born Roman. Actually, that point seems to be the linchpin in much of the ancient Roman belief towards sexuality, and that as long as whoever was on the receiving end is either a slave, prostitute, or non-Roman, it's fine. In fact, the main important factor comes down to masculinity. So long as you are the dominant male, are not infringing on your male peers, are of a higher status, and not appearing effeminate, pretty much anyone is fair game. It is on this part that Nero became controversial. Nero famously married a freed slave by the name of Pythagoras, famous for sharing a name with the Triangle Man but not the same person. Nero appeared as the bride for the wedding, wearing a veil, and when the pair consummated the marriage, it was done in full view and light for all to see. In doing this, Nero appeared effeminate and submitted to a person of lower status, both of which were considered extremely taboo. Nero is also known to have engaged in pederasty with eunuch boys, don't look that up, as well as a number of other heinous acts. If we were to rate Nero on an alignment chart of homosexuality, he would be chaotic evil and not invited to the Pride Parade. Moving from Rome, we head next to Greece. To quote an unknown source, the Greeks invented the orgy, and then the Romans revolutionized it by adding women. The accuracy of this historical perspective may be skewed by the lesbian orgies that were certainly a Greek thing as well. So to begin, much like everything else about the Romans, they stole their concept of sexuality from the Greeks and changed it to better fit their needs. This is to say that pretty much everything that I've said about the Romans' cultural sexuality applies to the Greeks as well, with two primary differences. 1. Greeks had significantly less qualms about pederasty, and also were more likely to skirt the rule of dominance in favor of affection. Much like the Romans, there was no real concept of sexuality, but rather a hardcore version of who was the top and who was the bottom. In the event of two consenting adult men, there existed a social stigma, but only for the bottom. This is because it was viewed as being effeminate. However, each Greek city-state had its own views on these unions, and in some, like Thebes, it was actively welcomed and encouraged, and there are several historical anecdotes of happy homosexual couples from Thebes. But how does this apply to fate? Well, perhaps the most famous Greek male-on-male relationship is supposedly Achilles and Patroclus. Now, it should be noted that Homer writes these two characters in the Iliad to be emotionally close, but never mentions sexuality between the two. There are instances where it may be implied, but it is never explicitly stated. Given the emotional closeness of the relationship, many modern scholars attribute these two as having been in a relationship, as well as the nod to Patroclus being much older than Achilles, making Achilles the beautiful youth. Funny enough, for those in support of this theory, there's an entire subcategory of argument as to who was the passive receiver and who was the active engager. Then there's Theseus and Pirithous, who are regarded by some ancient and modern artists as having a relationship tipping over into the homoerotic. This one actually has a huge amount of evidence in support of it, so here's the rundown. Pirithous was essentially a fan of Theseus, and so wanted to meet him and challenge him. To get his attention, he stole Theseus's herd, and when Theseus pursued, both men took up arms. However, they were both so taken in by the beauty of the other that instead of fighting, they took a vow of friendship and were inseparable afterwards. In fact, so close was their relationship that in the myth, Theseus's wife felt left out and attempted to turn to adultery for attention. While nothing graphic is ever really mentioned, the implications are so fierce with Theseus that it's hard to imagine that he wasn't at least bisexual. And then there is Alexander the Great and his quote-unquote closest and dearest friend, Hephaestion. I actually covered this somewhat in the past in my Hephaestion-focused video, but I will recap that here. Alexander and Hephaestion were incredibly close friends from childhood. Hephaestion was essentially brought up alongside Alex for this very reason. The two were incredibly close, and they held a friendship according to others of the time, and even themselves comparable to Achilles and Patroclus. They even offered sacrifices at the shrines in Troy dedicated to the two heroes, Alex to Achilles and Hephaestion to Patroclus. It is hard to express in words the closeness of these two, but fate's interpretation that Hephaestion was Alex's shadow isn't entirely inaccurate. Everywhere one went, the other was sure to follow. Now, I would like to make one point very clear. You can just be incredibly close friends and never have any sexual tension between each other. With that said, this relationship certainly rides that line, with the biggest piece of evidence on the side that they may have been in some kind of relationship coming from the reaction of Alex at the death of Hephaestion. Alexander fell into a deep depression where he refused any and all food, had thrown himself onto the body of his friend upon its discovery, hosted a massive funeral, and begged priests to elevate his friend's soul to godhood. Keep in mind that at this time, Alex was viewed as an actual god by some. Further, he never really recovered from this loss. This death was a turning point for Alexander, leading to a permanent decline in his health and eventually his own death. Again, they could just be very close friends, but this reaction does feel a tad excessive for them to have just been the dearest friends. An additional Greek I want to mention is Leonidas. He was likely the same as other Greeks of his time, which is to say he likely engaged in some form of bisexuality. But I more so want to talk about a humorous anecdote about the Spartan marriage ceremony. This ceremony involved the kidnapping of a bride-to-be girl, who would then be presented to a bridesmaid. The bridesmaid shaved the girl's head and dressed her up as a man, and then put her in a room where her groom would routinely visit. It's not fully understood why they did this, but a prominent theory is that men and women rarely interacted outside of their family structure, and so men were not accustomed to seeing women. So, the idea was to make the girl appear more like a man so the groom would accept her more easily without freaking out. I just love the idea of a Spartan warrior so excited to consummate his marriage, the girl dropping the trowel, and him being bewildered and confused as to why she doesn't have a cock. That's neither here nor there, but I found that while researching the subject, so there you go. Let's move away from Europe briefly to take a look at Japan. For some reason, I think a lot of people view Japan as this magical land where same-sex relationships are frowned upon and have been frowned upon since time immemorial. It could be a byproduct of modern laws in place or wishful thinking of certain groups, but I am happy to inform you that homosexuality in Japan was and is alive and well. In fact, it wasn't until after the Meiji Restoration and the introduction of more Western thought that homo and bisexuality became more taboo. Japanese Shintoism, for example, historically has no special rules in regards to sex, accepting it as a natural phenomena. Even in the world's very first novel, The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, the protagonist has sex with a man rather than his quote-unquote chilly old sister. So, That brings us to two figures in fate I want to discuss here: Oda Nobunaga and Mori Ranmaru. I don't think that Oda Nobunaga needs an introduction, but Ranmaru was a page of the Mori clan in the service of Nobunaga. Ranmaru was supposedly an incredibly beautiful youth, so much so as to be mistaken as a girl. We do not have exact details on his life, but it is commonly accepted that he and Nobunaga shared a sexual relationship. Again, at the time this was considered normal, as was the age of Ranmaru, who died when he was only 17, defending Nobunaga during the Honnoji incident. This isn't to say that Nobu exclusively practiced the Japanese version of Greco-Roman boy-man love, because there is also evidence of his attraction to one of his other retainers, Yasuke. There is a note that exists in regards to Yasuke that Nobunaga stripped the man to see if he was truly black because his skin tone was supposedly so dark as to look like he was coated in ink. During this, Nobunaga was supposedly fascinated by Yasuke's dick. The veracity of this claim is up in the air, but I have seen it around a few times, so I thought it'd be worth mentioning. Take that one with a grain of salt. Let's now touch on some more modern people that appear in Fate. Starting off, we have Mary Anning. There is no evidence to suggest what sexuality Anning was. The popular notion that she was a lesbian in the modern thought is spawned primarily from two sources: her close relationship with other women in life, and a 2020 film about her called Ammonite. Anning was often taken advantage of by men in her life because during her time, women were viewed as wholly lesser than and incapable of contributing to modern science. As such, she was not taken seriously as a paleontologist by the stuffy men of modern science. So, she often found herself in the companionship of women, notably Elizabeth Philpott and Charlotte Murchison. In the film Ammonite, these friendships are interpreted in a much more romantic light and paint Anning as a lesbian. Now, the interesting twist is that this film came under fire by some critics for the sexuality aspect of it. Some were in support of the claim that Anning was gay, while others were vehemently against it. This film attracted the attention of two still living relatives of Anning who offered their opinion. Lorraine Anning supported the lesbian claim, while Barbara Anning rejected it. In other words, we don't know, but this is an interesting bit of history nonetheless. Up until now, we have been mostly playing with assumptions and theoreticals. Many of these are ancient or long ago cases, so we may never know the truth. But there is one real person in Chaldea that is definitively bisexual, a well-loved character by both players of FGO and people from around the world: Hans Christian Andersen. There are a huge amount of letters written by Andersen confessing his love for other men. Some of these did result in actual relationships, while others were met with flat-out rejection and an end of correspondence. Famously, one of these successful relationships was with a member of royalty, Grand Duke Karl Alexander. It is debated as to whether or not any of these male-on-male relationships result in anything physical, but entries into Andersen's diaries as well as some letters suggest so. However, not every relationship was positive, and it is suggested that at one point during a visit with Charles Dickens, somehow Dickens figured out that Andersen was attracted to him, either by a confession or implication, and was disturbed by this, sending him away and no longer speaking with him. Andersen did seem to have an attraction to women as well, but was less successful in his attempts. There is an argument that exists that because Andersen was deeply religious, it was impossible for him to be homosexual. Finally, I want to talk about two figures in history, one from antiquity and one from the modern era, who both fall into the realm of transgenderism. I've done videos on both of these figures in the past, so if you want more details, check those out. Let's start with Canis. Born a woman, Canis was assaulted by the big bastard of the ocean, Poseidon, who decided to grant her a wish. She wished to become an invincible man so that she would not bear his child, and would never run the risk of being assaulted again. Poseidon obliged and transformed Canis into a man. He would go on to lead a successful career as a warrior of the Lapiths, notable for his strength and impenetrable skin. At one point joining up with the Argonauts and fighting alongside the likes of Heracles and Jason. Canis would be a member of the Centaurimachia, a wedding celebration turned into a battlefield by the unruly nature of centaurs. Canis would fight bravely, but would eventually be overwhelmed by the centaurs, throwing trees on top of him until he was buried so far beneath the ground that he suffocated. Regardless of this being his demise, he was regarded among the ranks of the mightiest men that the earth ever bred. Our final figure for today is Cavalier Daon. Daon was a French spy and soldier who had androgynous features, appearing throughout their life as both a man and a woman. Daon was supposedly born a male and lived the first 44 years of their life as a male, with the exception of a stint in Russia in which they appeared as a female and spied on Queen Elizabeth of Russia. Here they were presented as a maid of honor, and had they been caught, would have been executed, as at that time Russia was being occupied by the English. Sometime later, Daon had been exiled from France due to political issues and was living in London, where people began circulating a rumor that Daon was actually a woman. Soon after, people began to place bets and asked Daon to undergo an examination to show their gender, to which they refused. Following this and the death of King Louis XV, Daon negotiated a return to France, which was eventually accepted, and claimed to have actually been a woman the whole time. After this, Daon would officially be recognized as a woman until the day that they died. Daon attempted time and again to return to military service and even at one point offered to lead an all-female platoon to assist against the Habsburgs. But these were all shot down primarily because of their previous banishment, but now also because they identified as a woman. Undeterred, Daon showed off their abilities as a soldier by participating in fencing matches for money, and was famously very skilled. They did this until they were injured and eventually retired, living with a widow until they died at the age of 81 in poverty. The eventual autopsy showed that Daon had male genitalia, but also female body characteristics, such as fully formed breasts and limbs more common with a woman's than a man's. Daon is one of those curious cases in history, and a fascinating subject to read about. And that is it. Hope you all learned something fun. Let me know what you thought down in the comments. I am more than certain I missed some characters, and I have a few in the back of my mind. For now though, check the links down below for my Discord, Twitch, and Twitter. But for now guys, keep your chin up. Peace.